The first-class cabin of Horizon Airlines Flight 237 from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport to Miami gleamed with understated luxury. Polished leather seats stretched wide, a faint hum of wealth buzzed in the air, and the scent of freshly poured coffee mingled with the crispness of high-altitude anticipation. Emma Carter stepped aboard, her worn sneakers silent against the carpeted aisle, a stark contrast to the clicking heels and polished loafers around her. She wore a simple gray sweater and faded jeans, her only adornment a silver watch, a gift from her husband, James Jim Harrison, ticking quietly on her wrist. It was a reminder of their first meeting years ago when she'd been a flight attendant and he'd been just another passenger in a suit. Today, though, she carried a first-class ticket, a rare indulgence Jim had insisted on after her tireless work, organizing a charity gala that raised millions for Seattle's homeless youth. "You deserve this," he'd said, kissing her forehead before rushing off to an emergency board meeting, promising to join her in Miami later. Emma adjusted the watch, its cool metal grounding her as she approached her seat, 2A. The cabin buzzed with quiet chatter, businessmen flipping through Wall Street journals, a couple in matching Burberry scarves sipping champagne. But it all stopped when Lydia Brooks, the head flight attendant, stepped into her path. Tall and statuesque, Lydia's navy uniform hugged her frame, gold stripes glinting like medals of authority. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, not a strand out of place, and her green eyes narrowed as they swept over Emma's modest attire. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lydia said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I think there's been a mistake. This section is for first-class passengers only." The words hung in the air, heavy with judgment, and Emma felt the weight of every gaze in the cabin turned toward her. Emma straightened her shoulders, refusing to let the sting of Lydia's tone unravel her composure. "There's no mistake," she said evenly, pulling the boarding pass from her pocket and extending it toward the flight attendant. Her fingers brushed the edge of the watch again, a silent anchor as the cabin's attention sharpened. Lydia took the ticket with a delicate pinch, as if it might soil her pristine French manicure, and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny. She hummed, her lips pursing into a thin line. "This does say 2A, but I'll need to verify. Systems glitch all the time." Her voice dripped with condescension, loud enough to draw a few smirks from the nearby seats. A young man in a tailored blazer, Tyler Evans, Emma would later learn, glanced up from his phone, his smirk widening. "Guess everyone's trying to sneak into first class these days," he muttered, just audible enough to spark a ripple of amusement among the other passengers. Emma's cheeks warmed, a flush creeping up her neck, but she held her ground. She'd faced worse in her years as a flight attendant, rude passengers, mid-flight emergencies. But this was different. This was personal, a jab at the life she'd chosen to keep simple, despite being married to one of the richest men in the Pacific Northwest. "My husband booked this seat for me," she said, her voice steady, though she hated how it sounded like a plea. Lydia's perfectly arched eyebrow lifted higher, skepticism etched into every line of her face. "Of course, ma'am," she replied, her smile tight and insincere. "Let's just double-check that, shall we?" She turned toward the galley, ticket in hand, leaving Emma standing alone under the weight of a dozen judgmental stares, the first whispers of doubt beginning to coil in her chest. Lydia Brooks lingered near the galley, Emma's boarding pass still pinched between her manicured fingers, her head tilted as if deciphering a riddle. The hum of the Horizon Airlines cabin faded into a tense hush, every eye darting between the poised flight attendant and the woman she'd left stranded in the aisle. Emma stood firm, her hands clasped in front of her, the silver watch catching a glint of light from the overhead bins. She could feel the heat of scrutiny radiating from the first-class passengers, some curious, others openly amused. Tyler Evans leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms with a smug grin. "Maybe she's got a coupon or something," he quipped, loud enough to earn a chuckle from a woman in a silk scarf 2 rows ahead. The sound grated against Emma's nerves, but she kept her expression neutral, years of training kicking in like muscle memory. Lydia finally turned back, her heels clicking with deliberate precision against the floor. "Well," she said, drawing out the word as she handed the ticket back to Emma, "it does say 2A, but I'm afraid there might be a mix-up. These things happen. People get bumped up by mistake." Her tone was syrupy sweet, laced with a venom that made Emma's stomach twist. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous habit from her days serving coffee at 30,000 feet, and met Lydia's gaze. "There's no mistake," she repeated, her voice low but firm. "My husband booked this for me." The words felt heavier this time, a shield she didn't want to wield but couldn't avoid. Lydia's lips twitched, barely suppressing a smirk. "Your husband, huh?" she said, her eyes flicking over Emma's sweater and jeans. "Let's hope he's got a good explanation for this." The cabin seemed to shrink as Lydia's words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, like a challenge disguised as courtesy. Emma's pulse quickened, but she refused to flinch, her fingers brushing the edge of her watch for strength. She remembered the day Jim gave it to her, a rainy afternoon in Seattle, his blue eyes warm as he said, "Time's the only thing we can't buy, Em. Spend it well." That memory steadied her now, a quiet rebellion against the judgment closing in. Tyler Evans snorted, leaning forward in his seat. "What's next? She'll say her husband owns the plane?" he said, his voice carrying a mocking edge that sparked a few more titters from the rows behind. A couple in matching designer coats exchanged whispers, their eyes darting between Emma's faded jeans and Lydia's pristine uniform. From the corner of her eye, Emma caught a different gaze. Grace Sullivan, an older woman with silver hair and a pearl necklace, watching with quiet curiosity rather than scorn. It was a small lifeline, but Emma clung to it. "He doesn't need to own the plane," she said, her tone calm but pointed. "He just needs to know I belong here." Lydia's smirk faltered for a split second, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Well, darling," she replied, her voice rising just enough to command the room, "I'll need to run this by the system again. We can't have just anyone sitting up here, can we?" She gestured toward the galley with a flourish, then paused, adding, "Why don't you wait by the gate while we sort this out?" The suggestion landed like a slap, and Emma felt the air shift. Pity from some, disdain from others. She took a deep breath, knowing the real test was only beginning. The first-class cabin of Horizon Airlines Flight 237 turned into a theater of whispers and sidelong glances, with Emma Carter caught center stage. Lydia Brooks had retreated to the galley, her heels clicking like a metronome of authority, leaving Emma exposed under the spotlight of a dozen pairs of eyes. Tyler Evans leaned back in his seat, twirling a pen between his fingers, his smirk now a permanent fixture. "This is why I stick to private jets," he said loudly, nodding toward the couple in designer coats, who nodded back with thin, approving smiles. Their whispers grew bolder, words like "out of place" and "probably a glitch" floating through the air like smoke. Emma's chest tightened, but she kept her chin up, her fingers tracing the familiar curve of her silver watch. She'd dealt with turbulence before, both literal and human, but this felt like a storm brewing just for her. Across the aisle, Grace Sullivan adjusted her pearl necklace, her lined face softening as she watched Emma. Unlike the others, her gaze held no judgment, only a flicker of recognition that Emma couldn't quite place. The older woman's silence stood out against the rising tide of commentary. "Some people don't know their lane," the woman in the silk scarf muttered, her voice carrying a practiced disdain. Tyler chuckled again, louder this time. "Bet she's got a sob story ready. My husband's a big shot, right?" The mockery stung, each word a pinprick against Emma's resolve. She wanted to snap back, to tell them she'd earned her place here long before Jim's money ever entered the picture. But she swallowed the urge. Years of calming irate passengers had taught her patience, and she'd need every ounce of it now as the pressure mounted. Emma's silence only seemed to fuel the cabin's growing restlessness. The couple in designer coats leaned closer, their whispers now a low hum of speculation, while Tyler tapped his pen against his armrest, each click a taunt. "Can we get this show moving?" he called out, glancing toward the galley where Lydia had disappeared with Emma's boarding pass. "Some of us have actual business in Miami." The jab landed and a few passengers nodded, their impatience turning Emma into an easy scapegoat. She felt the weight of their stares pressing down, a familiar ache from her days as a flight attendant when passengers blamed her for delays or lost luggage. But this was different. This wasn't about a job. It was about who they thought she was or wasn't. Just then, Marcus Tate, the cabin manager, emerged from the galley, his expression caught between professionalism and unease. His navy cap sat slightly askew, a crack in his otherwise polished demeanor, and he cleared his throat before speaking. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Emma with a cautious nod, "we're just confirming your reservation. It won't take long." His tone was neutral, but Lydia's shadow loomed behind him, her arms crossed and her lips set in a tight line. "Confirming what?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Marcus hesitated, glancing at Lydia, who stepped forward with a clipped, "Protocol, ma'am. We can't let just anyone sit here without verification." The phrase echoed her earlier barb, and Emma's patience frayed. "I have a valid ticket," she said, louder now, her words cutting through the cabin's murmur. The tension spiked, a held breath before the storm, and every eye turned toward the aircraft door, as if waiting for something or someone to break the deadlock. The air in the Horizon Airlines first-class cabin thickened with anticipation, every rustle and whisper amplifying the standoff between Emma Carter and the crew. Marcus Tate shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the brim of his cap, while Lydia Brooks stood behind him, her posture rigid with unspoken triumph. Emma's declaration, "I have a valid ticket," still echoed, a defiant note hanging in the silence. But the weight of the passengers' stares pressed harder. Tyler Evans tapped his foot impatiently, his earlier amusement souring into irritation, and the couple in designer coats exchanged a look that said they'd seen this drama play out before. Grace Sullivan, though, remained still, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her eyes fixed on Emma with a quiet intensity that felt like a lifeline. Then, with a slow, deliberate creak, the aircraft door swung open again, cutting through the tension like a blade. A tall figure stepped into the cabin, James Jim Harrison, all 6 feet 2 inches of him, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His gray suit, tailored to perfection, caught the light, and the silver at his temples gleamed faintly against his dark hair. The cabin fell silent, a collective intake of breath as his presence shifted the air itself. Jim's steel-blue eyes scanned the scene, methodical and unhurried, taking in Marcus's nervous stance, Lydia's sudden stiffness, and the sea of wide-eyed passengers. They settled on Emma, standing alone in the aisle, her chin still high despite the flush on her cheeks. "Emma," he said, his voice deep and measured, carrying across the cabin without effort, "is there a problem?" The question was simple, but it landed like thunder, and for the first time, Lydia's confident mask cracked, her hands twitching at her sides. Marcus Tate stammered, his voice catching as he stepped forward. "Sir, we're just resolving a small seating confusion," he said, his tone shifting from firm to fawning in an instant. Lydia's eyes darted between Jim and Emma, her earlier arrogance evaporating as she registered the weight of his presence. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jim raised a hand, silencing her without a glance. He moved down the aisle with the calm assurance of a man who owned the space. Not just the plane, but the moment itself. Each step was deliberate, his polished shoes silent against the carpet, and the passengers shrank back instinctively, their whispers dying out. Tyler Evans sat up straighter, his pen frozen mid-twirl, while Grace Sullivan's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Jim stopped beside Emma, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture both protective and possessive. "This is my wife's seat, isn't it?" "2A?" he asked, his voice steady, the faintest trace of a Midwestern drawl softening the edges of his authority. Lydia blinked, her face paling as if the blood had drained from it entirely. "Your wife?" she repeated, the words stumbling out like a question she hadn't meant to ask. Jim's gaze shifted to her, sharp and unyielding, and for a moment the cabin seemed to hold its breath. "Yes," he said simply. "Emma Carter Harrison. My wife." The name landed like a revelation, a quiet bomb that rippled through the seats. Marcus clutched his cap tighter, and Lydia's gold stripes suddenly looked less like badges and more like burdens. Jim's hand stayed on Emma's back, a silent promise, as the first cracks of truth began to splinter the crew's assumptions. The first-class cabin of Horizon Airlines Flight 237 froze in a stunned silence. James Jim Harrison's words, "Emma Carter Harrison, My wife. Still reverberating like a gavel strike. Emma felt the warmth of his hand on her back, steadying her as the weight of his presence reshaped the room. Lydia Brooks stood rooted to the spot, her green eyes wide, the gold stripes on her uniform glinting dully as her composure unraveled. Marcus Tate fumbled with his cap, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while the passengers' earlier smirks faded into a mix of shock and curiosity. Tyler Evans lowered his phone, his bravado extinguished, and the couple in designer coats sat rigid, their champagne glasses forgotten. Only Grace Sullivan seemed unfazed, her pearl-clad fingers tapping lightly against her armrest, as if she'd expected this all along. Jim's steel-blue eyes locked onto Lydia, his expression calm but piercing. "You were saying something about a mix-up?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild, each word carrying the quiet force of a man who rarely needed to raise his voice. Lydia swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. "I... we didn't know, sir," she stammered, her earlier venom replaced by a tremor of panic. Jim tilted his head slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm. "Didn't know what?" he pressed, then turned to Emma, his gaze softening for a moment before hardening again as it swept back to the crew. "That my wife was the youngest chief flight attendant in Horizon's history? That she knows more about this airline's protocols than anyone here?" The revelation hit like a thunderclap, and Emma's breath caught, her past colliding with the present in a way she hadn't anticipated. Emma's fingers brushed the silver watch on her wrist, the cool metal a tether to the days when she'd worn a Horizon Airlines uniform herself. Jim's words stirred memories. Long shifts, turbulent flights, the pride of earning that chief flight attendant title at 27. She hadn't expected him to bring it up. Not here, not like this. But the truth hung heavy in the air, shifting the cabin's dynamic. Lydia's face drained of color, her tight bun seeming to wilt as she clutched the edge of a seat for support. Marcus muttered a weak, "That's impressive." But his voice was lost in the rustle of passengers adjusting their postures, suddenly aware they'd misjudged the woman in the gray sweater. Tyler Evans stared at his shoes, his pen now still, while the couple in designer coats exchanged uneasy glances. Then Grace Sullivan spoke, her voice cutting through the silence like a bell. "I remember you, dear," she said, her tone warm but firm, drawing every eye to her. 10 years ago, you helped me on a flight to Chicago, spotted my dizzy spell before I even knew it was coming, saved me a hospital trip." The older woman's smile was small but genuine, and Emma blinked, a flicker of recognition sparking. "Mrs. Sullivan?" she murmured, the name surfacing from a decade-old roster. Grace nodded and a murmur rippled through the cabin, respect replacing ridicule. Jim's hand tightened slightly on Emma's back, a silent acknowledgement of her worth beyond his name. "She's always been exceptional," he said, his gaze returning to Lydia and Marcus, now visibly shrinking under its weight. "So tell me," he added, his voice dropping to a steely edge, "what exactly were you verifying?" The question lingered, a challenge unmet, as the crew's authority began to crumble. James Jim Harrison's question, "What exactly were you verifying?" hung in the air like a guillotine blade, poised above the fragile authority of the Horizon Airlines crew. The first-class cabin remained silent, the weight of his steel-blue stare pinning Lydia Brooks and Marcus Tate in place. Lydia's hands trembled slightly, her gold stripes no longer a shield but a spotlight on her faltering composure. "Mr. Harrison, we were just following protocol," she managed, her voice cracking as she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus nodded vigorously, his cap now clutched to his chest like a lifeline. "Standard procedure, sir," he added, but the words sounded hollow, drowned by the shift in power that Jim's presence commanded. Emma stood beside him, her shoulders relaxing under his touch. Though her mind churned with a mix of relief and unease, she hadn't wanted it to come to this. Jim's expression didn't waver, his calm demeanor more intimidating than any outburst. "Protocol," he repeated, letting the word linger as he pulled his phone from his pocket. His fingers moved with swift precision, typing a message that made Lydia's eyes widen in dread. "I've just emailed the board," he said, his tone conversational yet final. "Starting tomorrow, every Horizon employee will undergo mandatory anti-discrimination training." He paused, his gaze locking onto Lydia. You, Ms. Brooks, will be the first in line. The statement landed like a thunderbolt, and Lydia's knees buckled slightly, her hand gripping the seat harder. Marcus stammered an apology, but Jim waved it off, his focus unwavering. This isn't about mistakes, he said, his voice dropping lower. It's about consequences. The passengers watched, transfixed, as the man in the gray suit dismantled the crew's arrogance without raising his voice, the balance of power tilting decisively in Emma's favor. Emma felt the shift in the cabin as keenly as a change in altitude, the air buzzing with a new tension, one of awe rather than scorn. Jim's hand remained steady on her back, a quiet anchor as he turned his attention from the crew to her. You okay? He asked softly, his blue eyes searching hers, a flicker of concern breaking through his steely facade. She nodded, though her throat tightened. She'd wanted to fight this battle herself, not lean on his name. But before she could speak, Grace Sullivan's voice rose again, clear and steady. About time someone put manners back on the menu, the older woman said, her pearl necklace glinting as she leaned forward. This young lady deserves better than this circus. Her words sparked a murmur of agreement, a crack in the passenger's unified front. Tyler Evans shifted in his seat, his earlier bravado replaced by a sheepish hunch, while the couple in designer coats avoided eye contact, their champagne now flat and untouched. Jim gave Grace a slight nod, a rare smile tugging at his lips, before addressing the crew again. My wife's been through enough today, he said, his tone firm but not harsh. Let's make sure she's comfortable from here on out. Lydia nodded mutely, her face ashen, and Marcus scrambled to adjust his cap, muttering, Of course, sir. Jim guided Emma to her seat at 2A, his presence a shield that silenced any lingering doubts. As he sat beside her, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, the passengers' gazes now laced with curiosity and a hint of respect. Emma touched her watch, feeling the tide turn, but knowing the real reckoning of her own strength and their judgment still lay ahead. The Horizon Airlines first-class cabin settled into a fragile calm as Jim Harrison, took his seat beside Emma Carter at 2A, his presence a quiet wall between her and the storm that had just subsided. The hum of the engines vibrated faintly beneath their feet, but the real shift was in the passenger's demeanor. Tyler Evans, once the loudest voice of mockery, now slouched in his seat, his pen abandoned on the tray table as he stared out the window, avoiding Emma's direction entirely. The couple in designer coats sat stiffly, their earlier whispers replaced by an awkward silence, their hands fidgeting with the stems of their champagne glasses. The air felt charged, not with judgment now, but with a reluctant reassessment, as if the cabin collectively realized they'd misread the script. Grace Sullivan broke the stillness, her voice carrying the weight of experience. I've flown Horizon for decades, she said, adjusting her pearl necklace with a steady hand. And I've never seen a crew so quick to judge and so slow to apologize. Her words landed like a gentle rebuke, and a few passengers nodded, their expression softening. Emma glanced at her, gratitude flickering in her chest. Grace's support felt like a bridge to her past, a reminder of the respect she'd once earned on her own terms. Jim leaned closer, his voice low. She's right, you know. You've always had a way of proving people wrong. His hand brushed hers and she managed a small smile, though the weight of the day still pressed against her ribs. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane prepared for takeoff, and the passengers' gazes began to shift, some curious, some chastened, hinting at a tide turning in Emma's favor. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the first-class cabin's atmosphere continued to evolve, the passengers' initial scorn giving way to a mix of unease and intrigue. Tyler Evans risked a glance at Emma, his brow furrowing as if recalculating his earlier assumptions, then quickly looked away when their eyes met. The couple in designer coats murmured to each other, their tones hushed now, less conspiratorial and more reflective. One of them, a woman with sharp cheekbones, caught Emma's gaze and offered a hesitant nod, a small crack in their polished facade. It wasn't an apology, but it was something, and Emma felt a flicker of vindication stir beneath her lingering discomfort. She touched her silver watch, its steady tick a reminder of the life she'd built beyond these fleeting judgments. Grace Sullivan leaned forward again, her voice cutting through the low hum of the cabin. "You know, dear," she said to Emma, loud enough for others to hear, "you remind me of myself at your age. Quiet strength, no need to flaunt it." She paused, then added with a wry smile, "Pity some folks only see what's on the surface." The comment drew a few soft chuckles, and Tyler's ears reddened, his fingers twitching toward his abandoned pen. Jim squeezed Emma's hand, his pride evident in the slight curve of his lips. "She's got a point," he murmured, then raised his voice just enough. "Maybe it's time Horizon reminded its passengers and its crew what real class looks like." The words hung there, a subtle challenge, and Lydia Brooks, hovering near the galley, flinched visibly. As the plane lifted off, the cabin settled into a new rhythm, the passengers' reactions coalescing into a quiet respect that set the stage for an unexpected reckoning still to come. The Horizon Airlines plane climbed steadily into the sky, the Seattle skyline shrinking beneath a blanket of clouds as the first-class cabin adjusted to its new reality. James "Jim" Harrison sat beside Emma Carter, his hand resting lightly on hers, a quiet reassurance amid the hum of the engines. The passengers had settled into their seats, their earlier chatter replaced by a subdued curiosity, though Lydia Brooks lingered near the galley, her movements stiff and her eyes avoiding the couple at 2A. Marcus Tate hovered nearby, his cap back on, but his confidence still rattled, issuing soft instructions to the crew. Emma leaned back, the leather seat cool against her shoulders, but her mind raced. She'd won this round, yet the victory felt borrowed, tethered to Jim's name rather than her own. Jim turned to her, his steel blue eyes catching the dim cabin light. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. She managed a faint smile, her fingers brushing the silver watch. "Just thinking," she replied, then hesitated. "I didn't want it to go like this." He nodded, understanding flickering across his face, and for a moment they sat in companionable silence. Then, with a decisiveness that startled her, he straightened. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said, his tone shifting to one she recognized from his boardroom days. "Horizon's been looking for a director of customer experience. I put your name forward before all this happened." Emma's breath caught, her eyes widening as the words sank in. "Me?" she whispered, disbelief mingling with a spark of pride. Jim smiled, a rare, genuine curve of his lips. "There's no one better suited, Em. You've lived it, on both sides now." The proposal hung between them, a lifeline to the independence she craved. Emma's heart thudded as Jim's words settled over her, the idea of the director of customer experience role igniting a mix of excitement and doubt. She glanced at him, searching his steady gaze for any hint of pity, but found only conviction, a belief in her that she'd sometimes forgotten to hold herself. "You planned this before today?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jim nodded, leaning closer. "It was supposed to be an anniversary surprise," he said, his tone softening. "Your experience, your vision, you're the one who can fix what's broken here." The weight of his trust pressed against her, a gift wrapped in responsibility, and she felt the stirrings of a purpose she hadn't touched since her flight attendant days. Across the aisle, Lydia Brooks caught the tail end of their conversation, her hands pausing mid-motion as she arranged a tray of drinks. Her face tightened, a flash of panic crossing her features, before she masked it with a forced smile. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, her voice overly bright, her eyes flicking nervously to Emma. Jim waved her off with a curt, "We're fine," but his dismissal carried an edge that made her flinch. Marcus Tate, overhearing from the galley, stepped forward, his tone apologetic. "We'll make sure everything's perfect for you both," he said, shooting Lydia a pointed look. She nodded stiffly and began serving Emma with a deference that bordered on parody, her hands trembling as she poured a glass of water. The cabin watched, a silent audience to the crew's humbling, but Emma's focus stayed on Jim's proposal. As the plane leveled off, she felt the first threads of a new chapter weaving together, one that might finally bridge her past and present. The Horizon Airlines plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, the steady drone of the engines filling the first-class cabin with a deceptive calm. Emma Carter sat beside James Jim Harrison at 2A, her hands resting in her lap, the silver watch on her wrist ticking softly as she processed his unexpected proposal. The director of customer experience role lingered in her mind, a tantalizing thread connecting her past as a flight attendant to a future she hadn't dared imagine. Jim glanced at her, his steel blue eyes catching hers with a quiet question, but she offered only a small nod, still wrestling with the weight of it all. The cabin around them had hushed, the earlier drama replaced by an uneasy stillness, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next act. Lydia Brooks moved through the aisle with mechanical precision, her navy uniform crisp but her demeanor brittle. She avoided eye contact with Emma, her hands steadying a tray of drinks with exaggerated care, each clink of glass a muted apology. Marcus Tate shadowed her, his cap now perfectly aligned, issuing soft commands to the crew, as if to prove their redemption. The passengers, too, had retreated into themselves. Tyler Evans stared at his phone, his fingers idle, while the couple in designer coats flipped through magazines they didn't read. Only Grace Sullivan seemed at ease, her pearl necklace glinting as she sipped her water, her gaze occasionally drifting to Emma with a knowing warmth. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, layered with unspoken regrets and shifting perspectives. A fragile truce that could shatter with a single word. Emma felt it pressing against her, a reminder that this flight was more than a journey to Miami. It was a test of who she'd choose to be. Emma's gaze drifted to the window, the endless stretch of clouds below a mirror to her swirling thoughts. The silence in the cabin felt like a held breath, each passenger and crew member locked in their own recalibration. She remembered her first flight as a Horizon flight attendant, nervous but eager, pouring coffee for a businessman who'd later become her husband. Jim had been just another face then, his quiet charm disarming her over a 3-hour flight to Denver. Now sitting beside him, she traced the edge of her watch, the memory grounding her as the weight of his proposal tugged at her independence. She'd fought to be more than Mrs. Harrison, yet here she was, her worth affirmed by his name. The irony wasn't lost on her, and it stung. Grace Sullivan's voice broke the quiet, soft but deliberate. "You've got a rare gift, dear," she said, leaning across the aisle. "Seeing people for who they are, not what they wear. I saw it back then, and I see it now." Emma turned, meeting the older woman's steady gaze, and felt a warmth bloom in her chest. "Thank you," she murmured, the words a lifeline to her old self. Lydia, passing by with a tray, faltered at Grace's comment, her eyes flicking to Emma before dropping again. Tyler Evans shifted uncomfortably, his phone now dark, while the couple in designer coats pretended not to listen. Jim squeezed her hand, his voice a whisper. "She's not wrong, Em." The plane droned on, the silence deepening, but Emma sensed a shift, a subtle unraveling of the day's tensions. As Miami drew closer, she knew this flight would end with more than a landing. It would mark a turning point, one she'd have to face head-on when they touched down. The Horizon Airlines plane descended toward Miami International Airport, the first-class cabin bathed in the golden glow of a late-afternoon sun filtering through the windows. Emma Carter felt the subtle shift in pressure as the aircraft dipped, her fingers resting on the silver watch that had steadied her through the turbulent flight. Beside her, James Jim Harrison adjusted his tie, his steel blue eyes scanning the cabin with a quiet satisfaction. The earlier storm now a distant rumble. The passengers had settled into a subdued rhythm. Tyler Evans scrolled his phone with less bravado. The couple in designer coats sipped water instead of champagne, and Grace Sullivan sat with a serene smile, her pearl necklace catching the light. The crew, though, moved with a forced efficiency, their deference to Emma and Jim palpable but strained. As the wheels touched down with a gentle thud, the cabin exhaled, the tension of the journey loosening its grip. Lydia Brooks appeared from the galley, her navy uniform still crisp but her posture less rigid, offering a tight-lipped, "Welcome to Miami," that sounded more like a surrender than a greeting. Marcus Tate followed, his cap slightly askew again, murmuring apologies to no one in particular as he prepared the door. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt, her mind still circling Jim's proposal. the director of customer experience role that could redefine her place in the world she'd once left behind. She glanced at him, catching the faintest hint of a grin, and knew he'd orchestrated this landing as more than just an arrival. The intercom crackled, and a voice from the cockpit announced a delay at the gate, but Jim stood, offering his hand. "Let's stretch our legs," he said, his tone light but purposeful, signaling the next chapter was already unfolding. Emma took Jim's hand, rising from her seat as the Horizon Airlines cabin stirred with the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings. The air felt warmer now, tinged with the promise of Miami's humid breeze beyond the jet bridge. Lydia Brooks hovered near the exit, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting to Emma with a mix of resentment and resignation. "Safe travels," she said, her voice clipped, but the words lacked the bite of earlier. Marcus Tate nodded beside her, his attempt at a smile more grimace than greeting, and Emma offered a curt nod back, her focus already shifting. The passengers filed out slowly, Grace Sullivan pausing to pat Emma's arm. "You've got grit, dear," she said softly, then shuffled off, leaving a trace of warmth in her wake. As they reached the jet bridge, Tyler Evans lingered behind, his blazer slung over one shoulder. He caught Emma's eye, hesitating before stepping closer. "Hey, I was out of line back there," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, his voice low but sincere. "Didn't mean to pile on." Emma blinked, surprised by the shift, and nodded. "Thanks," she replied, her tone even but not cold. Jim raised an eyebrow but said nothing, guiding her toward the terminal. The moment lingered, a small crack in the day's armor, and Emma felt a flicker of hope. Maybe not everyone was as fixed as they seemed. Overhead, a radio crackled, summoning Lydia to an urgent meeting with Horizon's management, her face paling as she turned away. Emma and Jim stepped into the bustling Miami airport, the weight of the flight behind them. But the real conversation about her future, their future, loomed ahead, as inevitable as the sunset painting the sky outside. The Miami Beach resort stretched before Emma Carter and James Jim Harrison like a postcard come to life, its white stucco walls glowing under the fading sun, the ocean whispering against the shore. They stood on the private balcony of their suite, a bottle of Pinot Grigio chilling in a bucket of ice, the salty breeze tugging at Emma's hair. She leaned against the railing, her silver watch catching the last rays of light, her mind still tethered to the flight, the judgment, the proposal, the unexpected threads of redemption. Jim shed his suit jacket, rolling up his sleeves as he poured 2 glasses, his movements relaxed but his steel blue eyes watchful. "Quite a day," he said, handing her a glass, his voice a low rumble that matched the waves below. Emma took a sip, the crisp wine cooling her throat as she met his gaze. "I didn't want it to be about you," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I've spent years trying not to be just Mrs. Harrison." Her voice trembled slightly, a confession she'd held back too long. Jim set his glass down, stepping closer, his hand brushing her arm. "I know," he said softly, his tone carrying a weight of understanding. "That's why I pushed for the job. Because it's yours, Em, not mine." She looked out at the horizon, the sun dipping into the sea, and felt the tension of the day unraveling. The flight had stripped her bare, but this moment, this quiet space with him, offered a chance to rebuild. "You really think I can do it?" she asked, turning back to him, her eyes searching his. Jim's smile was small but certain. "I've never doubted you. Not once." Emma held Jim's gaze, the certainty in his eyes stirring something deep within her, a flicker of the confidence she'd once carried as a flight attendant, before wealth and titles complicated her sense of self. She set her glass on the railing, her fingers lingering on the stem as she spoke. "I miss it sometimes," she said, her voice softer now. "The independence, the feeling of earning my place." The admission hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Jim stepped closer, his hand settling on hers. "You never lost that," he replied, his tone firm yet tender. "I fell for you because of it, pouring coffee in first class, treating me like any other passenger, not some hotshot in a suit." A laugh escaped her, small but genuine, the memory of that Denver flight warming the edges of her doubt. The sky darkened, stars pricking through the twilight, and Jim's expression grew serious. The director role, it's not a handout, Em. It's because you see what's wrong and how to fix it. Today proved that. She nodded slowly, the weight of his faith sinking in, but a question lingered. What if I fail, she whispered, her eyes tracing the horizon. Jim squeezed her hand, his voice steady. Then you'll get back up, like always. The words echoed her own resilience, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek, brushed away by the breeze. You planned this before the flight, she said, a smile tugging at her lips. An anniversary gift? He grinned, a rare flash of mischief. Caught me. As they stood there, the ocean murmuring below, Emma sensed a decision forming, a step toward reclaiming her story, one she'd need to solidify before the night was over, setting the stage for a final reckoning. The Miami night draped the resort balcony in a velvet hush, the ocean's rhythm a steady pulse beneath the stars, as Emma Carter stood beside James Jim Harrison. The Pinot Grigio sat forgotten, its chill fading, while the weight of their conversation settled into a quiet resolve. Emma's silver watch gleamed faintly, a silent witness to the journey that had brought her here. From the flight's chaos to this moment of clarity, she turned to Jim, his steel blue eyes reflecting the moonlight, and took a deep breath. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady, the decision crystallizing like a vow. I'll take the director role, but on my terms. Jim's face softened, pride flickering in his gaze, and he nodded. Your terms, he agreed, his hand finding hers, a partnership reaffirmed. Inside the suite, the phone buzzed, a message from Horizon's board confirming Jim's earlier email about the training program. Emma glanced at it, then back at Jim. I want more than training, she said, her tone firming with purpose. I want Horizon to change, really change, so no one feels what I did today. She paused, her mind flashing to Lydia's sneer, Tyler's mockery, and Grace's quiet strength. Policies, culture, everything. Jim's smile widened, a rare full grin. That's my girl, he said, pulling her close, his arms a steady anchor. The decision felt right, a reclaiming of her voice, but a knock at the door interrupted the moment. Jim opened it to reveal Grace Sullivan, her pearl necklace glinting, a knowing look in her eyes. I hope I'm not intruding, she said, stepping inside, but I've just spoken to the board. They're behind you, Emma, thanks to a little nudge from an old passenger. Her smile was conspiratorial, and Emma's heart lifted, the pieces falling into place. Emma's eyes widened as Grace Sullivan's words sank in, the older woman's presence a final, unexpected gift. You did that? She asked, her voice catching with gratitude. Grace nodded, settling into a chair with the ease of someone who'd seen it all. I've got some pull left, she said, her tone wry. Told them Horizon's lucky to have you, someone who's been on both sides of the tray table? She chuckled, then grew serious. You've got a chance to fix what's broken, dear. Don't waste it. Emma felt a lump rise in her throat, the weight of Grace's faith merging with Jim's unwavering belief. She glanced at him, his hand still in hers, and saw the same resolve mirrored back, a partnership not just of love, but of purpose. The phone buzzed again, this time with news. Lydia Brooks had been demoted, reassigned to retraining under Emma's new program, a poetic twist that made her smile. Karma's quick sometimes, Jim murmured, and they shared a quiet laugh. Emma stepped back to the balcony, the ocean stretching endless before her, and felt the day's trials melt into something bigger, a mission. Time's the real luxury, she said, echoing Jim's words from years ago as she touched her watch. And I'm going to use it to make this right. Jim joined her, raising his glass, and Grace followed, her own lifted in a toast. To new chapters, Grace said, and they clinked glasses, the sound ringing clear against the night. As the stars burned brighter, Emma stood between the man who'd loved her from the start and the woman who'd reminded her of her worth, ready to rewrite Horizon's story and her own with a dignity that no one could take away.